Hello everybody and welcome to the fourth video in our series of videos on the Renaissance. As always, we begin with our learning outcomes. By the end of this presentation, you guys should know the benefits of the invention of the printing press. You guys should know 2 facts about Dante, Machiavelli and Cervantes. And finally, you guys should be able to tell me about 4 facts about William Shakespeare. So the first thing we will be looking at, and it is one of the most important inventions ever, and that is the printing press. So in 1450, Johann Gutenberg used his printing press to print the first copies of the Bible, which is now known as the Gutenberg edition of the Bible. Up until the invention of the printing press, books were handwritten by scribes or printed from kind of hand-carved blocks. However, Gutenberg used a combination of innovations such as a handheld frame into which thousands of movable metal letters could be arranged to spell out words and sentences, as well as a formula for an oil-based ink that transferred well onto paper. Paper itself was one of the great innovations. It had been brought to Europe from China by the Moors who inhabited Spain in the 11th century. And it was much cheaper than parchment or vellum, which the scribes had used up until then throughout the Middle Ages. He then used a press which would have worked like this to transfer the inked movable letters onto the paper. And with the new printing press, production of books skyrocketed, and by 1483 over 1,000 books were being printed in the time it would have taken a scribe to write one. And within those first 50 years there were over 250 printing houses. Now, the benefits were enormous. So for the first time, knowledge really went viral. Books they became cheaper, more people now had access to books, so literacy began to spread among the population in Europe. It saw the spread of new ideas and concepts as well. They travelled across the continent. Education became more accessible, as now you could learn what you needed from a book, and you didn't need to go and study in a college which very few people would have had access to. And the final benefit is it was harder for books and knowledge to be censored due to the amount of books that could be produced in such a short amount of time. It was hard to kind of contain them. So let's have a look at some of the important books of the era. The first person we are going to be looking at is an author called Dante. Now, technically, Dante's writings were before the Renaissance. Like we said, the timing of the Renaissance, while we're focusing on 1450 to 1550, it really happened before that and will continue to happen after that. And Dante was a writer from before the time of what we would classify as the Renaissance. But he popularized something that would take off with the advent of the printing press. And really, it's probably the final real benefit of the printing press. And this was that his book was written in the vernacular, which was the language the people of the country spoke. Now, up until this point, most people wrote in Latin because most books were only for the educated. However, Dante wrote his masterpiece, The Divine Comedy, in Italian. In the Divine Comedy, Dante wrote about the state of souls after death, where he imagines he is travelling through hell, purgatory and heaven. And in the book he speaks about the 9 circles of hell. Incidentally, he put the sin of usury, which we met when we were talking about patrons in our second video, he put them in the 7th circle of hell, which is a pretty bad place to be in hell. He said that users produce nothing of substance and only give the illusion of contributing, and is a mockery of God, your neighbour and yourself. And the final circle of hell, the worst circle of hell, the 9th circle, is reserved for those guilty of treachery against those who they had a special relationship with. This book was enormously popular. It dealt with a subject that many people were interested in, and it was more accessible again because it was written in the vernacular. Another famous author from this time was Petrarch, who was really seen as the father of humanism. Again, we met humanism before, but it is putting an emphasis on developing human potential and nature. It's kind of a philosophy driven by some of the writings of Petrarch. Now, one of the most famous Italian writers who is still read to this day is a man called Niccolo Machiavelli. He was inspired by Dante. He also wrote in the vernacular. However, Machiavelli was not even slightly concerned with what happened in the afterlife. He was concerned with power and how to stay in power. And his book, The Prince, is seen as one of the first books on modern political philosophy. Machiavelli wrote The Prince as advice on how a prince should rule. He wrote the book for the Medici to try to get back in their good graces after he'd been expelled from Florence by them in 1513. Remember from our video on patrons, the Medici had been overthrown by Savonarola and his theocracy. And after Savonarola's death, Florence kind of remained a republic for a while until the Medici finally returned to power in 1513. So Machiavelli was trying to give practical advice that might allow him back into the city to show that he was valuable to the Medici. So he didn't believe that ruling was a necessarily moral thing, but he looked at it more as a game with a set of rules that should be followed. He gave advice such as it is better to be feared as a ruler than loved, and that the ends justify the means. And you can see his ideas are still used in leadership today. They would definitely be seen as a noble thing in such cutthroat industries as stock market trading and stuff like that. So his ideas are still with us to this day. He's spawned the word. If you call someone Machiavellian, it's pretty much seen as a bad thing to be. It's someone who really believes that whatever they do, as long as they get what they want, that's all that matters. Another author from the time was a Spanish author called Cervantes. Now, Cervantes is famous for having written a book called Don Quixote, which many consider to be the first modern novel. This book would go on to influence the thinking in events such as the French Revolution. It was popularized in the imagination of generations to come. It really kind of gave the message that individuals can be right sometimes, even when society says they're wrong. And just to give that individual person that bit of a boost to believe in themselves somewhat, even when everyone's telling them they're wrong. However, probably the most famous author of all time also came from this era, and that is this man here, William Shakespeare. So Shakespeare lived from 1564 to 1660 in England, and he wrote some of the most famous plays ever. They are still performed, read, studied, learned by the majority of people to this day. Now, his plays are divided into three categories. So we had comedies, histories, and tragedies. Now, comedies were plays with happy endings, like Midsummer Night's Dream and The Merchant of Venice. Now, The Merchant of Venice is one that actually drew its inspiration from the thriving merchant community in Venice. They also had tragedies, which would have generally sad endings, and these included plays such as King Lear, Hamlet, Othello, and Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet is set in Verona in Italy, where two powerful families are feuding, much like what we would have seen in Florence and stuff like that, with the Medici and the Pazzi family and the hatred that was between those families. Drawing his inspiration from real life incidents, which is really the best form of art generally, tends to come from something that's real. Finally, then, he wrote histories based on actual historical people like Richard III and Henry VIII. Now, these plays were not seen as literature at the time, but were seen as a source of entertainment where people would come along to the theatre, they would shout and they would cheer if they liked the play, or they would boo and they would throw rotten fruit if they didn't like the play, and they were not adverse to doing this. It would happen quite regularly. So Shakespeare was part of the Kingsman Theatre Group and performed at the Globe Theatre in London. All 38 of Shakespeare's plays were performed here at the Globe Theatre. It was a very historic place in the capital city of England, in London. He also wrote 154 poems, which are called sonnets. So a sonnet is like a rhyming poem that is exactly 14 lines in length, with probably the most famous of his sonnets being Sonnet 18, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, which you can see there on the page also. So all of these writers, they made massive contributions to literature. They're still remembered to this day, and their work was able to be spread thanks to the printing press. The importance of the printing press, it can't be overstated. The only thing in human history that is comparable to the invention of the printing press is the invention of the internet. And like the internet, it revolutionized how people got knowledge, and it made it accessible to people, allowing for the exchange of ideas across the continent at the time in a way that really hadn't been possible before. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. So by now you guys should know the benefits of the invention of the printing press. There were many of them. Second, you guys should know 2 facts about Dante, Machiavelli and Cervantes. And finally, you guys should be able to tell me about 4 facts about William Shakespeare. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys got something good from this video.